Okay, it's 1 p.m. here, maybe 1:01. My clock's a little slow sometimes. So thank you all for joining us today. Really happy to have you all here for our webinar on conserving pollinators on New Mexico rangelands. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and the New Mexico Natural Resource Conservation Service have partnered to bring you this event, and I'm really thrilled to introduce our speakers today. We have Santiago Misquez from he is the New Mexico NRCS state biologist, and he's stationed in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We have Brenda Simpson, who is a rangeland management specialist with the National Grazing Lands team. She's in Grants, New Mexico, but she works out of the National Fort Worth NRCS office. We have Ray Moranz. He is the Grazing Lands pollinator ecologist with the Xerces Society in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And myself, I'm Kaitlin Haase, the Southwest Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society. And just a few housekeeping notes on webinars in Zoom. All the attendees are muted, but you can ask questions to us using the little Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And as we're presenting, please enter questions in there as they come up. That way we're not flooded with questions all at once at the end, and we can get to more questions, hopefully, and we can answer those in the Q&A as well by typing those out. Another thing to mention is that we do have closed captioning on this webinar. Thanks to our closed captioner. If you go down to, I think, more and then show subtitle at the bottom of your screen, that can get you to closed captionings. And yeah, feel free to enter any questions into the Q&A. You can also change which speakers you see. If you just want to see the slide, you can go up to the top and hit speaker view or presenter or gallery view. But if any of you have questions, feel free to type those into the Q&A. I'll be happy to help you figure out any Zoom things, and then also answer your questions on pollinators in rangelands. So with that, I'll let Santiago start presenting his slides, and we'll talk some more about pollinators in New Mexico rangelands. So thanks for coming, everyone. Appreciate this big attendance. Good to see all these people.
Thank you, Kaitlin, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks to all of you who have joined us today. It looks like we have a really decent turnout. As Kaitlin mentioned, I'm Santiago, and I'm coming from my telework office in the Northeast Heights of Albuquerque. I'm real happy to be here with you all today. Ray and I originally had intentions to deliver this training in person, to allow for field visits, of course, and more importantly, to have an open environment to discuss the subject. So please ask any questions that you may have. So as a conservationist over the years, I've learned more and more about pollinators and their habitats. My role, or at least one of my roles as an NRCS biologist, is to provide technical assistance to fellow conservation planners and landowners. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of pollinators and pollinator habitat. In the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the following.
Santiago, we can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen?
No, you haven't shared your screen yet.
I'm sorry, 1 second here. Let me do that. I didn't realize that I did not do that. I was rolling right along.
No worries.
Thank you for that. So you should be able to see my screen now. Is that correct?
No.
Not yet, no.
Oh, stand by.
We're getting
now it's coming.
Yes.
There we go.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just back up one more slide there. Well, I'll just continue from where I was at. As I was saying, on the next few slides, I'm gonna briefly talk about the following: components of pollinator habitat, agronomic values, environmental benefits, cultural significance, and more importantly, why does this matter? Why this discussion on pollinators and pollinator habitat? So somewhere between 75 and 95% of all flowering plants on Earth need help with pollination, mostly insects to move pollen from plant to plant. The other presenters are going to talk in detail about pollinator habitat. Kaitlin's going to give an awesome presentation on the different flowering plants, and Ray's going to go into a lot of detail on habitat specifics. But I just wanted to define just a few key points about habitat and relationships. So when we talk about habitat, we're talking about food, cover, shelter, connectivity, food being, pollen and nectar, cover, whether that's resting or shelter, overwintering type cover. It's really the connectivity, the spatial arrangement of the flowers across the landscape that are very important. As I mentioned, Kaitlin is going to talk in detail about flowering plants. I just wanted to mention that these are, considered formed shrubs or trees. And although we're going to be talking about pollinators, primarily insects, there are other forms of wildlife, such as bats, that perform mutually beneficial, they have mutually beneficial relationships with flowers. And so we just wanted to talk a little bit more about wildlife. So our rangelands are home to many species of wildlife for which pollinators support their existence. Pollinators are clearly important for the reproduction of flowering plants, but they're also critical in supporting wildlife, large and small. Chickadees bring about 400 caterpillars to their nests per day, per clutch. They feed their young for about 16 days, and this equates to about 6,400 caterpillars eaten by the clutch of birds. Also, at least 25% of birds and mammals rely on fruits and seeds, the result of which is from pollination. 89% of birds feed directly on pollinators and other invertebrates. Even grizzly bears eat pollinators. Army cutworm moths make up an important part of their summer diet because the moths are high in fat. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the agronomic values. Obviously, human nutrition is of vital importance. Most of our vitamins and minerals come from the plants we eat. 1,200 crops rely on pollination, and 35% of the crop production worldwide is because of pollinators. What that means is that about 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat is because of pollinators. Economically speaking, crop production annually worldwide, somewhere in the range of $235 to $570 billion. In the US alone, honeybee production accounts for $1.2 to $5.4 billion. Pollinators support the reproductive cycles of plants, right? So therefore, they're supporting many different types of ecosystem services. The clean air we breathe, the carbon sequestration, carbon cycling is part of what they support. Those plants themselves are stabilizing soils, thereby, improving water quality. They protect from severe weather. and they support other wildlife. The cultural significance. As we know, since the earliest origins, humans have depended on plants for their primary needs in existence. Plants provide food, medicine, shelter, dyes, fibers. Many native peoples also use plants in ceremonial or spiritual rituals. The document on the left there was produced from one of our plant material centers, reflecting the significance of plants that we've provided the public, the landowners. And as we know, there is a study, ethnobotany, of how people of a particular culture or region have made use of native plants. So what does this matter? Well, we have an opportunity and responsibility as agency staff to support ranchers. That lends right toward our mission of NRCS, which is to provide resources to ranchers and landowners to aid them in conservationists. We need to work together to maintain and improve pollinator habitat on rangelands. Ranchers are the stewards of these rangelands. These are vast landscapes, biologically rich lands that are important to pollinators. These landscapes provide contiguous and expansive areas of habitat. In turn, the pollinators provide a wide array of wildflowers, which provide valuable forage for cattle, food for wildlife, support soil health, and make rangelands more resilient. Brenda's going to go into a topic of livestock grazing, but research has told us that forbs are important, very important components of livestock diets, comprising upwards near 30% on a yearly basis, forbs. Continuing on with, why does it matter? On the left there, I have a slide from the USDA NAS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service, which is reflecting honeybee colonies. These are, captive or managed colonies. Over the decades, the trends have indicated a decline in these populations. From about, roughly 5.5 million in 1945 to about 2.4 million colonies in 2005. This is roughly about a loss of 3.1 million colonies, which support crop production. Western monarchs have declined over the years, 99% since 1980s. In the 80s, there was an estimated 4.5 million monarchs which were overwintering in California each year. In 2018, there was a mere 28,400 monarchs that were counted in California. Here in recent times, just this past month in November, the article that was published from the Xerces Society there is indicating that with roughly 30% of the data in, this again is this year's survey, winter survey for the monarchs, 30% of the data in, which includes some of the largest sites, there's only approximately 1,200 monarchs that have been reported. So if this is the case and reflects the rest of the monitoring sites, we may see fewer than 10,000 monarchs overwintering in California this year. So there's a lot of concern over these populations. But just today, just hot off the presses, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined, just today, the Fish and Wildlife determined that the monarch is warranted for listing as threatened or endangered, but the listing has been precluded by our higher listing priorities. So what does this mean? So this makes the monarch a candidate for listing, and associated policy now applies to NRCS planning procedures. So now as an NRCS employee, we must consider the monarch with that status going forward. On another note, there in the lower right, I have a photograph of a western bumblebee. It is also under review in the candidate or petition, in the petition process. We also have the rare plants, that flowering plants. And in 2017, the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy was published by the state forestry, the forestry division of the state of New Mexico, the Environment and Natural Resources Department. It lists or states that there are 235 rare and endangered plant species in New Mexico. When compared with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's online system, species reports, which indicates there are 130, this is for New Mexico, 130 flowering plant species of concern, of which 15 are listed, and four plants that are under review. So in conclusion, the values, benefits, and significance of pollinators and pollinator habitats cannot be overstated. They are critical to the survival of human beings. And long-term sustainability of productive rangeland holds the key to maintaining or improving pollinator populations. With that, I'll end my slideshow here. And I'll hand it back over to Miss Kaitlin there.
It's Ray. Are you ready, Ray? Thanks,
I'm
Santiago.
trying to link up. Okay. Okay, do you see my slide?
Yes.
Kaitlin?
Yes.
Looks great.
Very good, very good. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here chatting with you. Yes, indeed, Santiago brought up some really exciting news hot off the presses about the monarch, so I'll probably bring that up again in a few minutes. Also want to start off by talking about 4 general components of pollinator habitat, and Santiago covered some of these. First one being food. Of course, our butterflies and moths, they need host plants for the caterpillars, whereas the adults need nectar, and then our bees need nectar and pollen. Our flies need nectar primarily. Our insect pollinators need shelter. Luckily, and very often that shelter consists of bare ground, which fortunately New Mexico has bare ground in great abundance. Santiago pointed out that connectivity is a valuable aspect of pollinator habitat, and New Mexico rangeland is a lot of that. Another important thing is to have the environment relatively free of insecticides. This photo that you can see is a whole bunch of bumblebees on the ground that were killed by some insecticide spraying at a mall in Portland, Oregon, and I believe 20 or 30,000 bumblebees were killed in a single day. Fortunately, rangeland tends to be relatively free of insecticides. So indeed, rangeland usually does have those 4 components. This is some tallgrass prairie rangeland fairly close to my home in Oklahoma. And as you can see, quite lush, quite green, quite beautiful. There's plenty of food here because of the flowers. For the adults, we have plenty of milkweed foliage for caterpillars. We have grasses, which are also used as host plants for some larvae. We have plenty of shelter. There's some bare ground here. There are woody plants here that some bees can burrow into for their nests. We have connectivity. because this is a vast area connected to other vast areas of rangeland. And finally, this is an area with very little application of pesticides. Speaking of insecticides, and these next two slides are really where I have my Xerces hat on and not my NRCS hat on. Want to point out that USDA APHIS annually assists farmers and ranchers by applying insecticides in the Western US to try to control grasshopper populations. The Xerces Society is concerned by that practice to some degree. And we found that the vast majority of grasshopper species on rangelands are not pests. So we do want people to think about what they're doing before insecticides are treated on applied to rangelands to try to control grasshoppers. Because grasshoppers do play, a critical role in the food web out west. For instance, grassland birds do rely on them. So what is the Xerces Society doing? We've started communicating with APHIS to know about our concerns and to try to provide some recommendations. We are, again, need to learn that I can't click the pointer here. We are identifying at-risk pollinators. We are getting the word out. So please do look in the coming months for a Xerces Society best management practice document on grasshopper control. We understand that in some cases, it's pretty darn important to save a crop, maybe to save a piece of rangeland, but we do want people to be a bit careful with that. Okay, so what does pollinator habitat look like on a ranch? You should be able to stand at various places on your ranch and see several different species of flowers blooming by, different heights of vegetation, for instance, some short forbs, some tall forbs, maybe some shrubs or a few trees. You should be able to see some areas that are grazed more heavily than others, some areas that are lightly grazed, and very, very importantly, this last bullet, you should be able to see blooming flowers, a variety of blooming flowers in spring, summer, and fall, because many of our bee species live in spring, summer, and fall, and they need food throughout the entire growing season to make it. So here's an example. You're going to see this slide later when Kaitlin's going to tell you about each of these plants a little bit. But this slide is just showing you how you can have a site with some flowers in the spring, a variety of flowers in the summer, and a variety in the fall. That's a very important feature to have. Now this leads me into the next aspect of my talk, which is how to assess pollinator habitat using a product called the Habitat Assessment Guide. The Xerces Society has developed multiple pollinator habitat assessment guides. Right now you can see two photos of two covers. The one on the left is for farms. The one on the right is for natural areas in rangelands. So of course, the one that we're most interested in today is the one on the right. And in that document, the basic idea of the document is that you can take this document out to the field and before you do any further management to it, you can give your ranch a score. How does it score for pollinator habitat? And you're looking at 5 main features of landscapes, the site, the abundance of foraging habitat, the availability of native bee nesting habitat, and then management practices. And after you go through all the worksheets of this, which you could do in less than an hour, I've done it in less than an hour, you get an overall score. And then maybe you get some assistance from NRCS and carry out a whole bunch of conservation practices, and you come back 2 years later and you run this again and you get your after scores. It's a simple tool. I promise, it is simple. I can't go into it in detail, but here are a few of the details. When I mentioned landscape features, one of them that you'd look at is you would assess what is the dominant vegetation within 1/2 mile of where you were standing. And in many cases, I would hope in New Mexico, your rangeland would be predominantly native plants. If that's true, then it scores a 10 out of 10. you do something similar for your site, right where you are. What percentage of your site is natural or semi-natural habitat? If a very high percentage of it is natural or semi-natural, like native range, then you get a score of 10. If, on the other hand, much of it has been is improved pasture or cropland or something like that, it gets a much lower score, and so on and so forth. This is an important one. You get a score for foraging habitat based on the number of species of forbs, flowering shrubs, or pollinator-friendly trees that you have in bloom in spring. And then you do this again in summer and in fall, and you get separate scores for each. This guide does have pictures in it. For instance, here, pictures of what nesting habitat could look like. You might have some woody plants out there. They can serve as nesting habitat. And then you might have some herbaceous stems that could be nesting habitat. And once again, you total all the results to get a final score. Pretty simple tool, fun to use. If you want to find this tool online, please search Xerces Habitat Assessment Guides. Now I want to finish up my section with a few slides about other documents. For those in NRCS, you may have the National Range and Pasture Handbook. The current version is from 2003. That version lacks edition on pollinators. I'm happy to say that the 2021 edition will have a new section on pollinators. And as of now, I'm one of the people who will be writing it. Hopefully, the new handbook will have a more colorful cover page. This one looks like the Beatles' White Album, so pretty minimalist. And anticipated publication of the new National Handbook, fall 2021, I believe. Some other documents that you could consider obtaining are this guide to managing for monarchs in the West. And it is indeed out west where monarchs need the most help. As Santiago pointed out, there are a few thousand left. And as he pointed out, Fish and Wildlife Service did say today that listing of this species as threatened is warranted. They just feel that they don't have time for it right now. To find this document, search for Managing for Monarchs. We have this document, about 90 or 100 pages, highly detailed information on pollinators in Western rangelands. It does a very thorough literature review of the topic. To find it online, search for pollinators on Western rangelands. And finally, completed in February this year, we have a similar document for Great Plains rangelands, which does include eastern New Mexico. To find it online, search for Rangeland Management and Pollinators. Okay, that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Kaitlin, your turn.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ray. I'm really excited to follow up on that. Thanks, Ray and Santiago. And I will now be talking a little bit more about more specific plants and pollinator habitat. So you know a little bit about what good pollinator habitat looks like, and I'll do a little deeper dive into what species you might want to see in rangelands on New Mexico. So now I'll be discussing some major plant groups and a few select species that occur broadly across New Mexico rangelands. But there are more detailed pollinator plants lists available for the Southwest region, specifically these NRCS and Xerces list. I made this Albuquerque Santa Fe region list this year, and I'll be making more lists specific to other regions in New Mexico and the Southwest in the future. But I'm also available to provide site-specific plant recommendations. So my email's down here, and you'll see it on the ending slide too. But you can always reach out to me if you would like to request any site-specific pollinator plants. I also just want to mention that the Extension IPM team with New Mexico State University is also working on research to find the most attractive mix of wildflower species that will attract the most pollinators and have this really nice list of species that will provide the most habitat and attract the most pollinator species. So keep an eye out for that research when it's published. So there are several groups of plants that are especially important or attractive to pollinators for a variety of reasons. One of those being pollinator species, many pollinator species specialize on a specific plant group. And certain plants have developed features that are attractive to specific groups of pollinators. And some plants bloom in different seasons and are especially important to the pollinators active during that specific season. To support a diversity of bees and butterflies, you need lots of different plant species to have blooms throughout the year and support many specialist species. Now, right off the bat, from this group of species, you might notice several toxic to livestock plants, and I was just going to talk a little bit about that. Those ones that I want to point out are milkweeds, locoweeds, and groundsels or ragworts. And these have varying levels of toxicity, but the good news is a lot of these toxic plants are pretty unpalatable and they're usually avoided by livestock if they have other forage to go to. The three things that really determine how toxic a plant is are the animal eating it, so which livestock species, the plant species, so not all milkweeds are as toxic. They don't all have the same toxicity levels. And then how much of the toxic plant is consumed. So if it's a little bit of consumption, it may not be a big deal, but if you have a lot, then that's when you need to worry. And the good news is that livestock poisonings can really be avoided by adjusting stocking rate so that these toxic plants aren't proliferating and you have other forage available, and maybe providing supplemental forage when necessary. And while some pollinator plants may be toxic, there are also really palatable, nutritious, desirable forage species for livestock and for pollinators. So for example, the flower on the bottom here is a purple prairie clover, and it's a decreaser species on rangeland, and it's also attractive to many bee species. So I'm going to go through several plant groups that you might encounter on rangelands, mostly going in chronological order of blooming season. So one of the very first things you may encounter on rangelands that are blooming are these mustards. They're bladder pods or whitlow grasses, and they're these little white plants, and they are really important for early emerging bees and butterflies because they're one of those first nectar and pollen resources on the landscape. Those insects that are out early in the year, this is one of their only resources they have. So another important thing to mention about these mustards are that they are an important host plant for many butterfly species. And there are these really early blooming ones, and then there are a couple really important ones. The spectacle pod and western wallflower, they'll kind of bloom throughout the year depending on precipitation. But mustards are a really important group. And I have a couple shrubs I wanted to point out, and while shrubs may not be desirable in open range, they are really excellent pollinator plants for a couple reasons. And if these plants are growing in drainages or on slopes, their deep roots are really excellent for soil stabilization, so they're a really important feature to have in rangelands. And the two I have highlighted here are sumac. So this picture here is of a three-leaf sumac. And on the bottom here, I have Mahonia or barberry. And these are really great for pollinators because not only do they provide flower or pollen and nectar resources, they're also a really great structure for nesting and overwintering sites. And that early blooming period is really important for those early emerging pollinators. And another thing about shrubs is that they can provide a lot of blooms compared to just like in the same space. If there were some wildflowers, herbaceous wildflowers blooming, that's great, but the shrubs can produce so many more blooms in one space. So they're a really great addition to a rangeland. Another group are native thistles. So the thistles attract a variety of bees, butterflies, and moths. And I'm sure you're all aware that many thistles, when we think of them, we might think, noxious weeds. But we have a lot of native species, and there's this really handy ID guide made by the Native Plant Society of New Mexico. So just if you Google New Mexico Thistle Identification Guide, you should be able to find this really easily. They also typically bloom in spring, which is again important for those early emerging pollinators. Another group are the loco weeds. They're these typically white or purple vetch or pea plants. They're nitrogen fixers, so they're also important for soil health, and they attract a variety of bees and butterflies. Another group that might be a surprise are cacti. So there are many specialist cactus bee species, so bees that only collect pollen for their young from cacti. And so if you have cacti blooming, then you're supporting those bee species most likely. Also, these more robust plants can provide a lot of nesting and overwintering habitat. And yeah, the tree cholla is one that I would just wanted to point out, very common on rangelands. And some bees even will nest inside the stems of tree cholla. Another one are beardtongues. So they're these tall stalked plants with purple to red to pink to white flowers. And they're usually blooming in late spring or early summer. But they're really great for bumblebees. You might notice that their flower shape is like a perfect little bumblebee size. So they're really great for bumblebees and many other native bees. Also, they're a host plant for checker spot butterflies. Another group are the milkweeds, and you might already know of this one because it is such an important host plant for monarchs and their caterpillars. But not only are they really great for monarchs, they also provide a really high quality nectar source for many pollinators. And they also attract beneficial insects. So things like wasps and lady beetles and other things that would be eating pests or that would be pests on rangelands, these milkweeds can help attract those natural predators of pests. And I just wanted to say this top milkweed here is horsetail milkweed, and it's very toxic, but cattle, because it's very toxic, it's very bitter, and cattle typically don't try to eat it. The milkweed on the bottom here is showy milkweed, and it's not nearly as toxic as horsetail milkweed. So if you do have some browsing of this species, they need to eat a lot to really affect them at all. Another group are Blazingstars, the Mentzelias. There's another Blazingstar liatris, but it's, specifically the Mentzelias are these yellow to cream colored flowers, and they bloom throughout the summer, and they do really well in disturbed areas. And they can attract a really big diversity of native bees. So just this top photo here is a tiny little perdita bee. You can see lots of these at a Mentzelia at one point. And then the bottom photo here is a Morrison's bumblebee. So you can just see the diversity and size, at least, of bee species that these flowers attract. Another group are the Vervains. These are typically purple flowers which bloom early to late in the year, and that can depend on precipitation. You might see them bloom after a big monsoon event. So the Vervains, this top verbena here, They attract lots of different bee species. Their flowers are a little more open and accessible, while the mock vervain, the bottom photo, it's a little more attractive to butterflies. They can fit their proboscis easily into their flowers. Yeah, so attracts butterflies and bees if you include both of those two genera. Another group are the Globemallows. We have lots of different Globemallow species in New Mexico, and they're really long blooming perennials with orange to pink blooms. And they also support specialist mallow bees. So there's some specialist bees that only collect pollen from these flowers. Now we're getting later into the season. So this is one of our fall bloomers, the Buckwheats. They're a really important host plant for many butterflies, and they also are a great nectar and pollen source for many native bees. And this is a large group that includes many species, the late blooming asters. And this combination of species can bloom from late fall or late summer into late fall. So we have helianthus here, just our annual sunflowers. They're great. They kind of bloom a little earlier in the fall. And then we have groundsels, senecio, those are blooming usually really late into the fall. And also our purple fall blooming tansy asters, those usually typically bloom very late. And then we have Verbacina insuloides or cowpin daisy, and that's one you can often see in rangelands or in some disturbed areas. And they're an important nectar source and pollen source for many bees and butterflies because they're very diverse and can be found throughout the state. And I don't want to give all the glory to our flowering forbs, and I really want to mention grasses are really great for pollinators too, with many butterfly species using grasses as host plants. Specifically, Bouteloua hosts lots and lots of different species. And not to mention the bunch grasses are really excellent sites for bumblebee nest. So yes, excellent overwintering habitat, and obviously the foundation of rangeland plant communities. And there are a few increaser species I wanted to mention that may indicate degraded range and can easily spread in an area and kind of create homogeneous plant communities. But I just wanted to mention them because they do support specialist bee species and lots of pollinators. So one specifically, mesquite, supports over 100 bee species in the Southwest, and many of those are specialists on the trees. So there are several specialist bees that will only collect pollen for their young from mesquite trees. And then also gumweeds, they're important because they produce flower resins. And there are some bees that specialize on collecting resins from flowers. And then also snakeweeds are one of the last blooming plants on rangelands, and they can support those pollinators that are active late into the year. So these really can take over in areas, but in small doses, they're good for our pollinators. I just wanted to give you a visual of what species you might see blooming on rangelands from season to season. And this group here are generally found on Northeast New Mexico plains. So scorpion weed might be one of the very first things you see, along with perky sue. A little later in the season, you might see cota or green thread, along with purple prairie clover. A little later in the year, well, kind of throughout the year, you can see upright prairie coneflower and hairy aster blooming. And then usually a little later into the year, you can see blanket flowers, and maybe in some wetter areas, you'll see solidagos or goldenrods later in the year. And then for our west part of New Mexico, more dry desert areas, you can see things like spectacle pod and sandbells in early spring, moving on to prickly poppies and Blackfoot daisies. And then we have some yellow asters that bloom for a long time in the summer, the desert marigold and paperflower. And then our fleabanes and groundsells will start blooming in fall. And this Riddle's groundsel is one of our latest bloomers that attracts a lot of different pollinators. So now that you know which plants on rangelands are good for pollinators, let's talk about what you can do to restore those plant populations on your property. So an essential part of restoring habitats for pollinators is to increase flowering plant diversity and abundance. And one way to do this is to seed or plant those species. And you can use the following NRCS conservation practices, but planting and seeding is a pretty difficult endeavor in our harsh, arid climate. Now, if you're considering this, one thing you can do to help you decide is to consider what may currently exist in the seed banks on your property. If you do see a good diversity of different species in bloom all year long on your property or in nearby surrounding areas, the seed bank likely contains those species, and those plants that are around and blooming are contributing to the seed bank and dispersing their seeds into your area, and could probably sprout and establish in wetter years. So seeding is a risky business, even if you do have infrastructure to water. Previous research done by NRCS staff has found limited success of seeding flowering forbs, a little bit better results with seeding native grasses. So if you do want to attempt seeding, I would include grasses just because they're more likely to establish, and definitely include mulching if you do seed any. And grasses are also, again, important for many pollinator species. They're forage for caterpillars and provide nesting and overwintering sites. And if you want to think about seeding, maybe you can plan for it in your other restoration and management practices. So things like brush removal can create really favorable conditions for seed establishment by creating pits, like depressions in the ground that collect more water compared to a relatively flat surface. So maybe seeding after brush removal into those pits and including some mulch on top of that could help establish some seeds. Now, NRCS research does recommend transplanting starts on irrigated sites over seeding. And I know this isn't really that possible for many rangelands, but if you do happen to have some irrigation potential, even if you create just a small planting with lots of different species of flowers that are blooming from spring to fall, that can really provide a lot of pollinator habitat, and then provide a seed source for your surrounding area. So just considering the unpredictable success of seedings or plantings in our arid environment, it is important to start with creating conditions to really improve overall plant establishment by doing things like increasing water infiltration, reducing soil erosion, enhancing soil productivity, and controlling invasive weeds. This will also just create more favorable conditions for existing pollinator plants in the seed bank to germinate. And not only are they helpful to pollinator plants, but just to overall rangeland health and production. And you're probably familiar with these Bill Z. Dyke erosion control guides. A lot of field offices will have those, but you can really easily find them just going to the Quivira Coalition's website and looking at their resources page. But these have really great detailed guidelines on how to create successful erosion control. Some methods for preventing major erosion problems and increasing water infiltration include microcatchments and using straw bales or rock mulch to slow water runoff, Also using woody material as mulch to reduce bare ground cover. Doing things like this is going to help retain soil. It also can catch a lot of seeds that might be flowing off of the landscape and give them a place, a solid foundation for them to establish. And these are great small scale, inexpensive methods you can do on your own with local materials to help prevent bigger erosion problems. If you do have some big erosion problems like head cuts or really extreme bank cutting, you can look into 410 grade stabilization practice. This picture on the top here is rock and brush structure, which is engineer designed, and the watershed and hydrologic features of the site are calculated in order to sizen. So just know that's an option if you have some big erosion problems. So with that, I will pass it on to Brenda, because while you can take steps to seed or plant pollinator plants, how rangeland is managed really determines the health of pollinator habitat on a really broad time scale. So thank you all for that, and I will stop sharing and let Brenda take over.
Okay, just a moment and I will share my screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, looks
okay.
Good.
Very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Kaitlin, for the introduction at the beginning of the webinar. A little background history. I've worked with NRCS for over 20 years now, and most of that in New Mexico. I do have the wonderful opportunity now to work for the Central National Technology Support Center, where I'm part of the National Grazing Land team. And we provide a lot of technical assistance to the states and support for our national office. And I'd like to just go into a little detail on range management and pollinators. So, okay. So incorporating pollinator conservation into the way you manage your rangelands may not require large-scale changes, but rather more of a shift to a broader view of rangelands as critical habitat for many creatures, large and small. Some of the common practices that are applied to rangelands to benefit livestock can also bring additional benefits to pollinators. I heard a rancher say once, one of my greatest moments was when I realized I was part of the community on my operation and not the only participant. So awareness of these other creatures is key. Small changes can lead to big effects that can benefit many other species dependent on our native range. The first practice I'd like to talk about is prescribed grazing. And what prescribed grazing is the practice of managing the harvest of vegetation by grazing animals. It's really about grass farming, growing forage and using livestock as a means of harvesting it. Livestock can be tools to improve and increase plant diversity, change structure and composition, and productivity and health of a plant community. Important aspects of grazing management are stocking rates or stock density. How many units of livestock are grazing or using the land during a certain amount of time? Also, timing of grazing. What time of year livestock are in a pasture in relationship to plant growth and dormancy? And duration. How long are they there? Frequency. How often do they come back? So the benefits of prescribed grazing are that prescribed grazing requires that you develop a grazing management plan document. That document leads with goals and objectives. Ranchers, for the most part, have grazing management plans, but many times it's in their head and may not be written down. And by having written goals and objectives, that increases the likelihood of achieving what you set out to. Further, by having a written inventory of the existing structures, the resource concerns on the operation, and a written forage inventory, A better picture comes into focus, helping producers see where they're doing well with their current management and identifying areas that could potentially benefit from making some changes. The forage inventory and the feed and forage balance worksheet help guide carrying capacity and stocking rate decisions and should promote plant health. Having a written strategy on when and where to move livestock, how long they will stay, and when pastures are rested helps give producers a way to track how livestock movement is affecting the plant community. Monitoring during grazing is important. Writing notes of grazing patterns that you're seeing within a pasture, measuring stubble heights, and observing what plants are being used will help a producer meet proper grazing use and develop a better understanding of the strengths of the pastures. And that will help with producers when they want to consider important habitat factors and vulnerabilities for pollinators. So making a few small tweaks could lead to huge successes. For example, recognizing that livestock may be scheduled to start grazing a pasture that has many beneficial blooming plants during one of the pollinator's critical life stages, say springtime, when bees are emerging and dependent on early forbs. So by considering a small adjustment in the grazing timing, maybe even by just a couple of weeks, flowering forbs may have a chance to bloom without grazing or trampling, and the bees would benefit by having a more ample food supply. Or another example could be recognizing that bees nest in the stems, in many stems during the winter. So by leaving a little higher stubble heights of forage and browse, and by removing livestock a little earlier, you could leave those stubble heights higher, and that could save bees that are still nesting in those stems. So one thing you want to avoid for sure is overgrazing. So overgrazing can be detrimental not only to the land as it decreases forage diversity, it also opens up the soil surface to erosion and reduces livestock productivity and even can eliminate many wildflowers. The stems that bees nest in can be trampled or eaten, and with overgrazing, soil compaction can become a problem which would harm ground nesting bees and other pollinators and their ability to, to have those looser soils to be able to create their nests. So best management practices for prescribed grazing is develop a grazing management plan, including a plant inventory, a feed and forage balance worksheet, and build flexibility into your stocking rate. Consider balancing stocking rates for cattle performance, but also for rangeland health and for wildflower abundance. Monitor utilization to avoid chronic overgrazing, and change the timing of use to allow different rest periods between years so that plants can recover during different parts of the year. For example, like resting in the early spring one year to help spring flowering forbs, and then resting during the monsoons or the growing season, the warm season, to help summer flowering forbs. And manage with a community perspective. Remember, we're all in this together, and never hesitate to reach out to a natural resource expert at NRCS or Xerces if you have questions on how to incorporate pollinators into your grazing management plan. So there are some tools available through NRCS to provide financial support for prescribed grazing. We have the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program, which both offer cost share assistance. So in the addition to being able to help pay for prescribed grazing, the practice of it, there's also an enhancement through the stewardship program that provides financial incentives to develop a grazing management plan that will increase the abundance and diversity of monarch nectar producing forbs, including the milkweeds. Usually the program deadlines for each year run close to the end of the calendar year. So if you're interested in more information on how you can build a grazing management plan with pollinators in mind, contact your NRCS field office for more information. Another practice I want to talk about is livestock watering facilities. In New Mexico, one of the critical limiting factors ranchers face is adequate livestock water, quantity, and quality. When ranchers install watering facilities for their livestock, they're improving habitat, not only for other species like wildlife, but also pollinators as well. Many water sources will be all abuzz with pollinators like bees, butterflies, flies, dragonflies. And remember, when you're building your grazing management plan, part of the plan is to inventory existing infrastructure. And that inventory would include current livestock water sources. So that inventory could provide details to which water sources have safe pollinator and wildlife access. A small investment of installing a wildlife ramp could lead to a huge benefit to the community and help eliminate pollinator drownings. This photo with this two-tailed swallowtail butterfly is a prime example. This was a ranch that I helped. They had a seep that cattle were getting into to water from. It wasn't providing very good water quality to the cattle because they were, knee deep, bogging down in the seep. So through a spring development, we developed a gallery, collected the water, sent it through a pipeline and stored part of it, which gravity fed to a livestock drinker. So everything benefited because the cattle got better and more dependable water having a storage and to be drinking out of a drinker instead of the seep. But also the seep recovered, and you can see some of the plant species came back when the cattle weren't inside the seep, and it really benefited this butterfly. The other thing is with watering facilities, this is a tire drinker, and you can see on the left-hand side of your screen that there's a sheer drop from the rim of the drinker to the water surface. And so many pollinators would be unable to negotiate that drop between the top of the drinker and the water. And while this wildlife ramp probably would not meet NRCS specs for a ramp, this rancher went and took the extra step. He had a little extra concrete, and he poured this concrete ramp in the drinker to provide safe access to many small wildlife. And also you can see how many native bees are enjoying the safety of this rough surface right at the water's edge. Another practice is brush management. And brush management is one of the most applied conservation practices in New Mexico. Many plant communities have increased in woody species that are either not part of the historic native plant community, or if they were part of the native community, they've increased in frequency and production to a level that's not natural. In either case, brush management can be an important tool for restoring a site back to higher condition. Here's an example of a sandy site in the southeast corner of New Mexico where shinnery oak had increased to the point of affecting the plant composition and production. And through a design treatment, you can see an increase not only in important grass species for livestock, but also an increase in flowering native forbs that were beneficial for pollinators. So this is the same site. The photo on the left was taken in 2012. There was tibuthyron treatment applied to this site, and in 2015, you can see the flush of bunch grasses, which like we talked about earlier, being important to bumblebee nesting, and then of course all the flowering pollinator species. So best management practices for brush management, and I'll throw herbaceous weed treatment in here. Herbaceous weed treatment is not commonly applied on rangelands in New Mexico, but it can be. But when you are going to use either one of these practices, remember that plant diversity is key to healthy rangelands. So when you're designing either of these treatments through chemical application, mechanical treatment, or burning, don't target all the plants. Don't design your control for 100%. Unless you're managing invasive species found like on the New Mexico invasive species list, then treating to 100% is definitely acceptable. Also treat spraying, target your spraying applications if you can, instead of using just a broad general broadcast spraying. Also use selective herbicides that instead of non-selective herbicides, so that you treat only what you're after. There's some herbicides that will treat many species, and if you can avoid those and select the herbicides that are only specific to the species that you're interested in, that would be a much better option. Also, take some time to identify plants before you spray. Don't spray your native forbs. There are many invasive thistles, for example, but then there are also some native ones that we talked about earlier in this webinar that are beneficial. So try and spend a little time IDing what you're spraying, so you know that you're spraying something that isn't wanted. And remember, like Santiago talked about earlier, livestock eat many forbs because they're nutritious. So don't feel inclined to manage your pastures for only grass. Livestock benefit from diversity and the ability to self-medicate. So it's okay to have the forbs out there mixed in with your grass. And lastly, follow the mixing labels on herbicides. Mix at the right concentration. So any herbicide mixed beyond the label can have detrimental effects to many other non-labeled species. Prescribed burning is another practice. It's an important management tool. While it's not used in New Mexico as extensively as in the Midwest states, prescribed grazing is important in the evolution of many plant communities here. The benefits of prescribed burning are to mitigate and reduce fuel buildup that increases wildfire risk, and wildfires can burn at much hotter intensities and can be devastating to plant communities, and even increase soil erosion and water quality risks. Prescribed burning can help manage invasive tree and shrub encroachments and maintain open grasslands and forest lands and promote a diverse herbaceous understory in both of those communities. It also encourages plant diversity with the flush of nutrients that are released. The ash from fire is incredibly rich in phosphorus, nitrogen, and even minerals like calcium. So these nutrients are all cycled back into the soil after a fire, which will be picked up by the roots of plants, and many times those plants will sprout much more vigorously the next year in their shoots and have more blooming multiple flower species that will be expressed after a burn. So this is a picture of near Duran, New Mexico. We burned a couple of years ago. The gentleman with the drip torch is a state conservationist, and he's assisted by our national prescribed burn leader he's a cohort of mine out of the Tech Center, Chuck Stanley. So this is what we were burning. It was grassland that had been invaded primarily by cedar trees. And after we burned, a year later, after a growing season in the monsoon precip, you can see the change in the plant community. And if you notice in the top right corner of the photo, you'll see a fence line, and beyond the fence line was not treated, and where we burned, of course, was treated. So you can see that fence line contrast. But you'll also see a flush of a lot of the grasses that we talked about being beneficial, and also the flowering forbs. So drawbacks to fire, there are a few drawbacks to fire, and right after a fire, you could have immediate loss of pollen and nectar food sources. It could eliminate some of the stem nesting for availability for bees for a couple of years. And it can kill some pollinators that are in life stages where they're non-mobile during the burn. So if you're going to consider using prescribed fire, the timing of the burn is important. Consider burning when pollinators are in mobile stages and can fly or move away from the fire. And don't plan to burn the entire pasture. A mosaic or patch burn effect will provide pollinators food sources in areas that haven't been burned. Those food sources will be intact, and they'll have cover until the burned areas are growing back. So rotate your season of burn if you can, and limit it. Don't shoot for burning the entire pasture. Range seeding, talked a little bit earlier about this. It is an important practice to increase plant diversity, improve production, and balance missing species in a plant community. but seeding is not always necessary, and sometimes is a little risky. We talked about that earlier. So good management can overcome many pollinator habitat limitations. This is a range site that was allowed to rest during the growing season, and the monsoon rains came right at the right time when the soil temperatures were optimum, and you can see the benefit and what happened. The result was just a sea of blooms. So what do pollinators do for rangelands? Santiago talked a little bit earlier about forage quality. Many wildflowers have high forage quality and are important components of livestock diets. He mentioned up to 30% of their diets. Studies have found that on a global basis, cool and warm season wildflowers have crude protein levels between 4 and 23%. So that's very comparable to our native cool and warm season grasses. And as a rule of thumb, to meet dietary requirements for a mother cow, a minimum of 7% crude protein needs to be maintained, so that you can see if she can mix her diet with grasses and wildflowers and forbs, she can easily exceed the minimum crude protein that she needs. So pollinators help sustain wildflowers by transferring pollen from one flower to another, and these flowering forbs then that grow provide forage for livestock and wildlife, and also increase soil health by helping diversify the plant community, which in turns make grasslands more resilient. So it's a beautiful natural system, all helping. So what can you do in conclusion? Understand that all things in nature are linked. Be part of that community. Go the extra step to consider pollinators by some simple things like adding wildlife ramps to drinkers. Avoid broadleaf spraying native forbs with herbicides. Know what you're spraying. Take a minute to ID your plants. Spot spray only when the threshold warrants it. Negative effect of no action outweighs the negative effect of taking the action. That's when you should spray. Avoid overgrazing. Rangeland needs to maintain a properly functioning plant community, and consider areas important for pollinators. Be flexible in your management to account for their needs, and learn more about pollinators from NRCS and Xerces. Remember, we're all in this together. Few additional resources. If you want to check into more about pollinators in New Mexico, I've got this list. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ray.
Thank you very much, Brenda. I want to just go over 3 quick slides. First, want to acknowledge the people who gave us a lot of information to help us with this talk. Daniela Roth, the state botanist of New Mexico. Olivia Messenger-Carroll, who is a bee expert of great renown, and Stephen Carey, a butterfly expert of great renown. So thank you, folks, for assisting us with natural history information. Need to point out that Kaitlin and I are employees of the Xerces Society, and we are responsible for thanking our supporters. We are funded by a variety of governmental organizations, nonprofit foundations, private corporations, and of course, by Xerces Society members. So thank you all for your support. We are a donor-supported nonprofit, so we need that support to keep on bringing you programs such as this. And finally, thank you. Thank all of you for attending. We'd love to hear from you. All 4 of us work to provide assistance to farmers, ranchers, the general public. So please contact us. As you can see, our emails are on here. Now, on my screen, our emails address are hidden on the bottom. Oh, goodness. That's a bit of a mess. So if you want to, obviously you can see Brenda's email address. If you want to reach one of the other 3 of us and you can't see our email addresses, please email Brenda and she'll forward it to us. At this point, Kaitlin, let's take care of questions and answers, right?
Yeah, let's go for it. Yeah, that was really excellent very informative. I've learned a lot working with you guys. And we've had some really good questions roll in. One of the first ones you wanted to answer live, right, was, is milkweed toxic to deer?
Okay. I do not know for certain. I've seen no studies on toxicity of milkweeds to deer, but I read book chapters about milkweed toxicity to animals, and it's almost certain that toxic milkweeds are toxic to deer. Highly toxic milkweeds tend to be toxic to most, if not all, vertebrates, including, so I would strongly suspect deer. On the other hand, there are milkweeds out there that have no toxin whatsoever. I studied these for my master's degree, and deer will eat those. And actually, I once helped plant 900 milkweeds in Iowa, and 700 of them got eaten by deer and rabbits in the first few weeks. So that's an answer. That's a bit of an answer for you. But yeah, more research needs to be done on that. But almost certainly the highly toxic milkweeds are also toxic to deer.
Great, thanks, Ray. Maybe you have a good answer to this one, Brenda. Isabel asked, planned grazing alone has shown to improve biodiversity of native grasses on rangelands. Is that true for flowering plants as well? Planned grazing specifically?
The answer would be yes. I mean, livestock can be used to reach multiple goals, and through targeted grazing, you can encourage plant communities. So doing planned grazing to increase forage production is an absolute, but then if you can also do
I can't hear Brenda. Can you, Ray?
I can hear Brenda.
Oh, weird. Sorry.
That's
Keep
okay.
going, Brenda.
Sure. So using targeted grazing could be a way to help increase flowering forbs. So sometimes doing a little more disturbance in some areas and increasing, a little bit of bare ground, you can bring in some flowering forbs like the earlier mustards and things like that, which would all fall under planned grazing. But you would want to target your grazing within your plan for what those goals and objectives are.
Great, thank you. Let's see, what other questions are we getting? We're getting some questions about will these slides be available to people? We can share all of those links that we've shared when we upload this recording to our YouTube channel. We can include those links and everything in the description of the YouTube video, so we can make sure you guys know where to find that. So thanks for wanting to learn more. Let's see, what other questions are there? There's not a lot. If you guys want to keep throwing questions at us, we'd love to hear. Athena asked, could Brenda talk more specifically about how the timing of grazing would benefit milkweeds? Is it mostly deferring in the spring?
Most milkweed plants, my experience, do start coming up in the spring. And in New Mexico, Athena, you don't find them just completely scattered. A lot of times you'll find them in certain areas. And I'm sure that has to do with soil type and maybe in areas where there's a little more overland flow run-in. And so if you find those areas that, or you look at an ecological site description, sometimes those forbs will be listed. You could find those soil types and those areas that have a little bit of moisture, and then set those aside and see if you get some milkweeds coming up in the spring. More times than not, you will find them starting to bloom. On my operation, I actually have some milkweeds. I find them down in the drain more, so a little clayier soils and with a little more run-in, and they absolutely do start greening up in the spring. And usually mine have gone to bloom about the end of June. So.
Great. Do you see any questions you want to address, Ray?
Yes, can you hear me still? Kaitlin, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good, very good. There are some comments folks made that I'd like to address. So Jim Armendariz commented about the value of highway rights of way and pointed out there's tons of that available, and if we could create or better manage pollinator habitat there, and he's exactly right. And my supervisor, Jennifer Hopwood up in Nebraska, is actually a national leader in right-of-way management for pollinators. She conducted research on it, and she's written a bunch of documents on it, and she is helping states achieve that on the ground. He pointed out that all it takes is to educate the highway departments in every state to include pollinator species in their seed mixes. We definitely want that to happen. There is a cost involved to that, of course, and so not every state is willing to pay for the pollinator seed mixes. And also, I've talked to numerous state DOT officials, and some of them feel lots of pressure from the public to mow very frequently. And frequent mowing on rights of way is bad news for pollinator plants. But he's exactly right. Jim, your comment is exactly right. Right of ways have enormous potential for pollinator conservation. And then Isabel commented that she was very surprised to hear herbicide treatments being recommended in a webinar about pollinators. In my experience, I'm not aware of much research that has demonstrated major negative effects of direct effects of herbicides to pollinators. Obviously, if you spray herbicides on all the wildflowers, that's going to eliminate the food sources. In my case, on our land here in Oklahoma, I apply herbicide to kill invasive plants like Old World bluestem, which are taking over the prairie and outcompeting the native wildflowers. So I use herbicide to help knock back the bad plants and help the good plants. And I'm praying that those herbicides are having no negative effect on the pollinators.
Great. Thanks for addressing those comments, Ray. I had one question we were kind of getting was where to source plant materials and where can we find help with plant propagation. Brenda or Santiago, do you have any specific resources for New Mexico on plant propagation and where to get these plant materials for pollinator plants?
Sure thing, Kaitlin. We have the Plant Material Center that has produced a number of documents, as been pointed out today. They at one time, some of those documents specifically talk toward plant propagation. Other sources of help with plant propagation, other than the PMC, would be local nurseries. Santa Ana Pueblo has a plant nursery here that are helping with our conservation efforts with native plant materials. Curtis & Curtis is another source. They sell, they're suppliers of materials, but Brenda, do you have any other recommendations on folks that can help with plant propagation?
I believe that there's documents that the Extension Service has put out. So if you Google New Mexico State Extension, all of their publications will come up and you can query by topic. And they have been just instrumental in putting a lot of guides together. One of the slide that I showed references was one of their documents on identifying native bees, and they do have other documents listed there for pollinators. So I would definitely circle back to the extension for some more of that information.
Great, thanks guys. Let's see. Yeah, you've answered a question from Janet, Ray. Do you just want to share that with everyone so they can?
Yeah, that's really important. Let's see. Janet Snowden asked us via the chat, does NRCS provide financial assistance to landowners who don't have livestock grazing? And the answer to that is most certainly. NRCS, of course, is in all 50 states, and they provide assistance to agricultural producers, including large-scale agricultural producers and small-scale agricultural producers. And they provide it for rangeland, but they also provide it for cropland, pasture land, a variety of agricultural land uses. So if in my case, my wife and I own 10 acres, and we are receiving assistance from NRCS to create pollinator habitat on our land, even though we do not have livestock. So absolutely, please contact your local USDA service center. They're in almost every county of the nation. So just do a Google search for USDA service center, USDA service center locator, and you'll get their number and give them a call. And I do see more new questions.
Ray, could you talk about the issue of forbs next to highways attracting wildlife that become potentially dangerous with roadkill and car?
Sure. And for that, I'll refer to the wisdom of my supervisor, who Jennifer, who I mentioned before, is a national level expert on this topic. She assures me that the scientific research shows that the positives of planting forbs next to a highway outweigh the negatives. Yes, indeed, some bees and butterflies get killed by cars. But she actually, one of the neat things is that research has shown if you have habitat planted along the road, the pollinators tend to stay on one side of the road more often rather than crossing it. So obviously, the more they cross the road, the more they get hit, more likely they get hit. When they stay on one side of the road, focusing on a pollinator population, they're less likely to get hit. So the research seems to favor pretty strongly the planting along highways.
Great. I thought you might have absorbed some of Jennifer's knowledge on that. I was like, oh, I don't quite know. Perfect. Let's see. Well, we're almost out of time here, unless there's any other questions I might have missed. I'm jumping between the question and answer in the chat and searching for any new ones. So if you all do want to check out the chat, a lot of people have recommended a few different resources, plant materials, people in Colorado to New Mexico, different places you can check out to find seeds of native pollinator plants. And we'll be sure to share with you all the slides and the resources that we have linked in that we were talking about. So we'll be sure to share that. Be sure to share that with you all. Yeah, I guess unless there's anything else, you, Brenda, Santiago, Ray, do you have anything you would like to end on? I just want to say that I'm really happy to be in New Mexico and glad to be working with the NRCS now. Xerces just expanded an office to New Mexico, and I was fortunate enough to get that position. And just to be building these relationships is really exciting, and appreciate all of you for attending and for NRCS for working with us.
We're extremely happy to have you on board, Kaitlin. Thank you so much. So wonderful to have you in New Mexico. And Santiago and Brenda, it's been a great pleasure for me to work with you too. And I look forward to additional work with you too in the future. And thanks everybody who attended.
Likewise, echo the same thoughts. Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Kaitlin and Brenda. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Have a good one.